The morning my supervisor handed me a termination letter in front of the entire regional sales floor, I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, looked at the letter, and thought about the email sitting in my inbox from the night before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I spent 11 years building something that my company couldn't measure on a spreadsheet, and the day they tried to erase it was the day I realized I'd already been given an exit door I hadn't walked through yet. I was a senior account manager for a mid-sized industrial supply distributor out of Columbus, Ohio. We served construction firms, manufacturing plants, municipalities, anyone who needed bulk materials on a reliable schedule. Not glamorous, not the kind of work you brag about at dinner parties, but I was good at it in a way that's hard to explain to people who've never done relationship sales. My territory covered 14 counties in central Ohio. I had accounts that had been with the company since before I was hired. I had accounts I'd personally rescued from competitors, accounts I'd grown from small recurring orders into six-figure annual contracts. Over 11 years, I'd developed what I called a contact system. Nothing proprietary, nothing fancy, just a habit I'd built by paying attention. I kept detailed notes on every client. Not just business notes, personal ones. I knew that the operations manager at Grayfield Construction had a daughter starting at Ohio State in the fall. I knew the purchasing director at Lakewood Municipal kept saltwater fish tanks in his office, and that he appreciated when I remembered to ask about them. I knew that the plant supervisor at Renner Fabrication liked to talk about his weekend fishing trips before we ever got down to business. My supervisor, I'll call him my boss because that's what he was, and that title already tells you most of what you need to know about how he saw our relationship. Had been at the company for 3 years. He came in from the corporate side of a larger firm that had acquired us, and he brought with him a philosophy that could be summarized in one phrase he used constantly: quantifiable outcomes. He was not wrong that outcomes mattered. He was wrong about what outcomes were worth quantifying. He ran the regional team like he was managing a scoreboard. Call volume, email response rate, proposal turnaround, pipeline velocity. Every Thursday, he'd pull the numbers up on the screen in the conference room and go through them one by one. Anyone below the average on any metric got a comment. Anyone above got a nod. That was the entire performance conversation, week after week for 3 years. My numbers were never his favorites. I made fewer cold calls than anyone on the team because I didn't need to make cold calls. My clients called me. My email volume was lower because my clients preferred to talk on the phone, sometimes for 30 minutes at a stretch, about things that had nothing to do with orders. My proposal turnaround was slower because I tailored every proposal to each client's actual situation rather than using the templated version the company had approved. The system worked. My retention rate was the highest in the region. My upsell rate was the highest in the region. 3 of my top 5 accounts had been with me personally for over 7 years, which in our industry meant they had survived acquisitions, price increases, product line changes, and at least 2 rounds of competitors actively trying to poach them. My boss didn't see any of that in his metrics. What he saw was that I was slower to respond, less active in the CRM, and spending what he considered excessive time on client calls that weren't generating immediate revenue events. He started saying things in the Thursday meetings, not directly to me at first. General comments about how the team needed to be more efficient, how relationship building was important, but had to be balanced with productivity, how certain account behaviors that felt comfortable weren't necessarily scalable. I knew he was talking about me. Everyone in that room knew he was talking about me. For about a year, I let it go. I told myself he'd see the results. The numbers would speak eventually. The retention would compound. The renewals would roll in, and he'd understand that the slower, deeper approach was paying dividends that his dashboard simply wasn't built to capture. I was wrong about that. Not about the results, about his capacity to connect those results to the method. The Thursday meeting where everything changed was in February. We had a team of 9 people in that room. 3 sales reps from the east side of the territory, 2 from the west, myself, my boss, the regional coordinator named Teresa, and the new junior rep who'd been hired 6 months earlier and was still finding his footing. My boss started the meeting the usual way. Numbers, metrics, scoreboard. Then he said he had a new initiative to announce. He was implementing a standardized client contact protocol. Everyone would use the same CRM template for client notes. All client communication would go through the company's approved channels so it could be tracked and measured. Personal contact files stored outside the system. He looked at me when he said this, and he didn't look away, would be migrated into the standard format or deleted. I asked what he meant by personal contact files. He said he meant the supplementary notes and client intelligence I'd been keeping in my own system. He said the company had reviewed it during an internal audit and determined it wasn't compliant with the new data governance policy. I told him I'd been keeping those notes for 11 years and they'd never been flagged before. He said the policy was new. I said the notes were the foundation of how I managed my client relationships. Removing them wasn't just an inconvenience, it was dismantling the actual mechanism that kept those accounts loyal to the company. He said he appreciated my perspective, but the decision had been made. Then he opened his laptop, navigated to the shared folder where I'd stored my contact intelligence, a folder I'd created, organized, and populated over more than a decade, and he deleted it in front of 9 people. He didn't hesitate. He just clicked, confirmed the deletion, and closed the laptop. The room was quiet for a moment. One of the East Side reps looked at the table. Teresa looked at her notepad. The junior rep looked at me with an expression I recognized, the look of someone who has just watched something happen that they're going to remember for a long time. I didn't say anything, not because I had nothing to say, because in that moment, the email from the previous evening came back to me with a clarity I hadn't felt when I first read it. The email had come from a man I'll call the VP of Commercial Partnerships at a company called Meridian Industrial. They were a regional competitor, newer than us, growing fast, and building out their account management team in Central Ohio. He'd reached out through LinkedIn 3 weeks earlier. I'd responded briefly and professionally because I had no reason not to. He'd followed up twice. The evening before the Thursday meeting, he'd sent a third message with a specific number attached. The number was a $108,000 base salary. Director of Client Partnerships, full benefits, quarterly bonus structure, and the explicit mandate to build an account management system the way I saw fit. I hadn't responded yet. Sitting in that conference room, watching my boss close his laptop, I made the decision to respond. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect this kind of story to involve rage or humiliation or a dramatic confrontation. What I actually felt was something closer to relief, like a door I'd been standing in front of for a long time had finally swung open on its own. I stayed through the rest of the meeting. I took notes. I asked a question about the new protocol's implementation timeline in a tone that was completely neutral. My boss seemed satisfied that I was falling in line. He wrapped up the meeting and thanked everyone for their flexibility during the transition. I walked back to my desk. I opened my laptop. I replied to the VP at Meridian and told him I was ready to have a serious conversation. What happened over the next 10 days is the part of this story that I think matters more than the moment in the conference room. I had a call with the VP that Friday afternoon. He was direct and thoughtful, in a way I hadn't experienced in a management conversation in years. He asked me to walk him through how I'd built my territory. Not the numbers, the method. He wanted to understand the philosophy behind the client relationships. He had specific questions about retention, about how I handled renewals during difficult pricing conversations, about how I'd managed accounts through the supply chain disruptions of the past few years. He'd done his research. He knew things about my territory performance that I hadn't shared with him. He told me that several of my clients had spoken about me in conversations that had reached Meridian through the normal network of the industry, that one of my largest accounts had mentioned my name specifically when Meridian's sales team had approached them about switching suppliers. The client hadn't switched. They'd told Meridian's rep that they weren't interested in changing suppliers, as long as I was handling the account. I asked him how he'd heard that. He said that kind of feedback travels, that in a mid-market regional industry, the accounts worth having talked to each other and to the vendors they're considering, that my reputation for client relationship depth had been circulating longer than I realized. My boss had thought he was deleting a folder. He had no idea that folder had already printed itself into the memory of the clients it described. I told the VP I was interested. I told him I had some questions about the structure of the role and the level of autonomy I'd have in building the system. He answered every question directly. When I asked if there was flexibility in the base, he said there was room to discuss. We discussed it. We landed on $112,000 with a first-year bonus target of 15% and a guaranteed review at 9 months. I asked for a week to think. During that week, I went about my work as normal. I made my client calls. I sent my follow-ups. I stopped entering notes into the new standardized CRM fields my boss had mandated, not as a protest, but because the fields were structured in a way that stripped out everything that made the notes useful. Name, company, last contact date, next action item. Nothing about the daughter starting college. Nothing about the saltwater tanks. Nothing about what it meant to someone when you remembered the things they'd told you. On Tuesday of that week, I called the operations manager at Grayfield Construction. He'd been my client for 9 years. I told him I'd been going through my notes, which existed in my head now, not in any folder, and I remembered his daughter had orientation coming up. I asked how she was feeling about the transition. He talked to me for 40 minutes. He talked about his daughter, about his own experience starting college, about how proud he was of her, and how much he was going to miss her being home. At the end of the call, he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "You know, I've worked with a lot of vendors over the years, a lot of good ones, but you're the only one who ever made me feel like I was calling a friend when I picked up the phone." I thanked him. I told him I genuinely enjoyed talking with him. Both of those things were completely true. I didn't tell him I was leaving. Not yet. That wasn't the right time, and it wasn't my place to create instability for him before anything was settled. But I filed that conversation away with the same care I'd always given to every conversation with that man. By Friday, I'd made my decision. I called the VP at Meridian and told him I was accepting the offer. He said he was glad. He asked about my timeline. I told him I planned to give 2 weeks' notice and that I wanted to handle the transition professionally. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office before my boss. I sat at my desk and I drafted a resignation letter. 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately upon delivery, professional tone. No complaints, no grievances, no reference to the Thursday meeting. Just the facts. I was resigning to pursue a new opportunity. I was committed to a thorough transition. I appreciated the years of experience. I printed it and walked to my boss's office. He was on a call when I knocked. He held up a finger, the universal gesture for "give me a minute," and I waited in the doorway. He finished his call and looked up. I handed him the letter. He read it. He read it a second time. He set it down and looked at me in a way that told me he was running through a calculation. What this meant for his Q2 numbers, for his team metrics, for the accounts I was managing. He asked where I was going. I told him I'd accepted a director role at another company. He asked which company. I told him. The expression on his face shifted in a way I can only describe as recognition. The particular look of someone who has just connected a series of dots they should have connected much earlier, and his understanding for the first time what those dots formed. He said he wasn't aware Meridian was expanding in the region. I said they were. He asked if I'd be taking clients with me. I told him I wasn't soliciting any of my current accounts, and that any decisions clients made were entirely their own. That was true, and I meant it. What clients did after I left was not something I was engineering, but I also wasn't naive about what relationships meant in this industry, and I suspected he wasn't either. He said he hoped I'd reconsider. I told him I had given it considerable thought, and my decision was final. I shook his hand. He seemed surprised by that. The handshake, like he'd been bracing for something more confrontational and hadn't prepared for ordinary courtesy. I walked back to my desk and spent the next 2 weeks doing the most thorough account transition I'd ever done in my career. I documented everything I could reconstruct from memory. I wrote detailed briefings on each of my top 20 accounts. I had transition calls with clients where I introduced them to whoever would be managing their account next and stayed on the line long enough to make sure they felt comfortable. I did this not because I owed my boss anything, but because I owed it to the clients. They hadn't done anything wrong. They deserved a proper handoff. On my last day, a Thursday, there was no meeting. My boss had canceled the weekly team call. I wasn't sure if that was intentional or coincidental, and I decided not to spend any energy trying to figure it out. I packed the few personal items from my desk. A framed photo, a small cactus I'd had on the windowsill for 4 years that had survived 2 office moves, and a drought during a stretch when I'd been traveling every week. I put them in a canvas bag and said goodbye to the people I liked. Teresa gave me a long hug and told me I deserved good things. The junior rep shook my hand and looked at me like he was trying to memorize something. I walked out through the lobby, past the reception desk where I'd checked in for 11 years of mornings, and out into the parking lot. It was cold. February in Columbus is not a poetic month. The sky was flat and gray. The parking lot had patches of old snow along the edges that had hardened into dirty ridges, and my car was exactly where I'd left it, completely unremarkable, exactly the same as every other morning. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute before I started the engine. I wasn't thinking about the folder he'd deleted. I wasn't thinking about the Thursday meetings or the metrics or the standardized CRM fields that had no room for the things that actually mattered. I was thinking about the operations manager at Grayfield Construction and his daughter starting college, and how 40 minutes of genuine conversation had accomplished more for that business relationship than any contact protocol my boss would ever design. I thought about what the VP at Meridian had said. that my reputation had been circulating longer than I realized, that the clients worth having talked to each other, that when a client tells a competitor's sales rep that they're not switching suppliers as long as a specific person is managing their account, that's not a metric on any dashboard, but it's the only number that actually matters. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. 3 weeks into my new role, the VP called me into his office. He said 2 of my former accounts had reached out to Meridian directly. They hadn't been solicited. They had found the company's contact information on their own and called to inquire about switching. He wanted me to know, he said, not because he expected me to do anything about it, but because, as he thought, I should understand the scale of what I'd built and what I'd brought with me when I walked out that door. I told him I hoped those clients would be well taken care of. He said they would be, and then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "I've hired a lot of experienced people in this industry over the years. Most of them bring their numbers. You brought your relationships. That's a fundamentally different thing, and I don't think your last employer ever understood what they had." I didn't respond to that right away. I sat with it. He was right that they hadn't understood it. I used to think that was a failure of vision on my boss's part, that if he just looked carefully enough, he would have seen what the relationships were worth. But sitting across from the VP in an office where people actually wanted to talk about the how, not just the what, I started to think it was something different. My boss understood numbers because numbers made him feel in control. The moment he couldn't quantify something, it didn't exist in his worldview. A client who stayed because of trust built over 9 years of consistent personal attention that didn't register. A phone call about a daughter's first semester, that was noise. A folder full of human context that made every transaction feel like a continuation of something real, that was clutter. He deleted clutter. He thought he was cleaning house. What he actually did was hand me the clearest possible evidence that I needed to leave, on a Thursday morning, in a room with 9 witnesses, before I'd even thought to ask for an exit. I've been at Meridian for 8 months now. I don't track my call volume. I don't measure my email response rate. I track my retention rate, my renewal rate, and the number of unsolicited client referrals I receive each quarter, which, in my first full quarter at the new role, was 4. My boss at Meridian asked me once if I had a formal system for maintaining client relationships, or if it was more intuitive. Told him it was both. That the intuition was just pattern recognition built over years of paying attention to what actually made people stay. He said that made sense. Then he asked me to document it, because he wanted to see if it could be taught. I said I'd think about how to put it into words. That conversation felt different from any Thursday meeting I'd ever sat through in Columbus. Not because the question was revolutionary, because the person asking it actually wanted to hear the answer. That's the thing about working somewhere that values what you do. You stop spending energy defending your methods and start spending it refining them. You stop translating your work into a language the wrong audience can understand and start developing it for the audience that already speaks it. The folder my boss deleted had 11 years of context in it. It's gone. I don't miss it the way I thought I might, because it turns out the folder was never really where the value lived. The value lived in the conversations that created it. And no one can delete a conversation that already happened.